And today we're talking about the wide, wild world of flowers. Hello, welcome to my eBiology teacher. I'm Mr. Doc, and today we're talking about flowers. Yes, flowering plants, they're incredibly important, and we need to understand them and how they work. More specifically, as you can see on the screen, we want to know the difference between those plants that do produce flowers and those that don't. We need to understand the parts to a flower and what each part does. We want to understand how flowering plants create new plants, which is their whole purpose anyway. And lastly, we want to evaluate the importance of flowering plants to the plants in the world at large. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. First of all, what we already know. We already know that flowers and plants in general can be divided into different categories based on their characteristics. And you can see that little thing, the little classification chart that we did in class. One major category of plants are those that do produce flowers, which are called angiosperms. Angiosperms produce flowers, and those flowers are the sexual organs, the sexual reproductive organs of a flower. Now, I know that's sort of odd to think about. We don't think about flowers or plants having sexual organs, but they do. And that's the whole point of flowers in the first place, is to act as sexual organs to produce new plants. All right? So, let's take a look at flowers. As you can see there, it's almost naughty, isn't it, to see all those flowers knowing that they are the sexual organs of the plants. We are looking at the sexual organs exposed. But that's what a plant wants. They want it to be exposed so that they can reproduce, and we'll find out why that is. But every angiosperm does produce a flower that's unique to itself. And despite the variety of flowers, even this little arrangement here, I've got some lilies, and I've got some roses, and I've got all kinds of little flowers here. They're all just drastically different, but they all basically serve the same purpose and all have the same basic structures that build them up. The job of any flower is to produce seeds, and those seeds will eventually become new plants, and that's really what they're good at. That's really what they do. So it's important to understand how they do it, and to do that, we need to take a little anatomy lesson. Yes, an anatomy of a flower. All right, and the first thing we want to look at are the external structures. Now, we all know what a petal is. This is a petal, and these are petals right here, right? Petal. We got petals right there. See that? Pretty petals. Those are the bright colored structures on a flower that make them attractive to would-be pollinators. And we'll talk about pollination in a minute. But in the diagram you see on your screen, these big purple panels are the petals. But as a flower is growing, it's going to have some small leaves that protect it as it grows, much like the ones you see here on this flower, these little green things. Those are called sepals. Sepals are specialized leaves that are designed to protect the bud as it grows. Now, there is a difference between a sepal and a regular old leaf, and if we look at this, we can tell. If you'll notice, first of all, the leaves of this rose are very, very thick, and they are very wide, but the sepals are very thin, but they're very tough. And the reason for that is their design is to be protective. They need to be tough in order to protect the beautiful budding flower that will eventually come out and beautify the world. All right, so we have those structures, and those don't have an active role in the creation of seeds. They do play a role, but we'll get into that in just a minute. Now, what we do need to understand is that most flowers are bisexual, or they have both parts. They have a female part and a male part. And that's important to understand, because that means that every flower that is like this, and there are some that aren't, but for the most part, most flowers have the ability to produce not only the male reproductive cells, which are pollen, and the female reproductive cells, or ovules. Okay, so let's look at the male reproductive structures. First of all, the male reproductive structure is called a stamen. The stamen has two parts. Now, let's look at this lily, because it's kind of easy to see. The stamen, let me grab a little pointer here so I can make this easier for all of us to see. The stamen are located here, okay, those big long things there. But they are divided into two parts. The anther, which is this big bulky thing here that has all that yellowish powder on it. See that yellow powder on there that I have? That's pollen. And then it has the filament, which holds it up. Okay, so we've got the filament, which is right here, and then we have the anther, which is that big orangey looking thing. The anther is where the pollen is produced, and as I've shown you, the pollen is there. And the pollen is the equivalent to plant sperm. Okay, it's the male reproductive seed, or the male reproductive cells. It's the gametes. That pollen will eventually produce a seed once it fertilizes an egg or an ovule. Okay, so the whole thing is called an anther. The top is called, the whole thing is called a stamen. The top is called the anther, and the little stem-like structure that holds the anther up is called the filament. The stamen, or stamen, that's the same word, singular, plural, is the male reproductive structure of a flower. As far as the female reproductive structure, we have the pistil, and the pistil is this thing in the center here, this whole thing, and it extends all the way from the top here all the way down the flower, where we actually can't see right now because of the petals being in the way, and I'll show you a different flower in a minute. Now it can be divided into three parts. This first part right here that we're looking at, it's kind of purpley on this flower, is called the stigma. Now this is sticky, and it's at the very top of the pistil. The reason it's sticky is because it wants pollen to stick to it so that it can be fertilized, right? So if we look here, we can kind of see that it's a little sticky, and that's because it wants that pollen to go down in there and fertilize it. The next part is the style, and that's the long stem-like structure that goes up and down right here. And if we look down here at the bottom, we have an ovary, all right? So let's take a look at an ovary, because I've dissected a flower for you so that we can get an idea of what we're looking at here, okay? That was a lily that we were just looking at. This is a hibiscus. Now, I've taken all the petals off, okay? But if we look, we have the style, right? We have the stigma, the style, and down here is the ovary. And if we look very close at the ovary, we can see little bitty dots. Those little bitty dots are ovules. Those are the equivalent to the egg. So if this yellow stuff here is sperm, there's my eggs right there. And that's why they have two reproductive structures. Now, once fertilized, these little ovules here will become the seeds. And that is obviously where the magic happens. All right, so once we have the anatomy understood, we can now go and see how this process happens. There are three major steps from going from a flower to an actual new plant. The first step is pollination. Now, pollination occurs because plants want to produce that pollen and send it out to other flowers. Pollination occurs when pollen from one flower connects to the stigma of another flower. And most plants are designed to prevent self-pollination, which would be pollen from my plant landing on my stigma, and that would be bad because then we don't have genetic diversity and things changing, and we learned earlier in the year that the genetic diversity is the key to survival. But how does pollen get from one stigma, or from one anther of one flower to the stigma of another? Well, there are a couple of ways. First of all, we can do wind pollination, and basically what that is letting the wind carry my pollen. Well, that's got some advantages in that you don't require another organism to be there, but it has some disadvantages in that you're kind of gambling. I mean, you've got to get, by luck, wind to carry that much pollen to the stigma, and that's such a small place. So you have to produce a whole lot of pollen, and your anthers have to be exposed to the world around you so that the wind can pick it up. Another way of getting pollinated is to use go-betweens or other organisms to pick up your pollen from one flower and take it to another. Now this is certainly targeted. This is, you know, I'm going to go here, then I'm going to go there, and that's much more efficient. However, you have to offer something like nectar or even pollen itself. I mean, bees like pollen. It helps them make their honey. But here's what happens. They will fly into a flower, they'll get pollen, but it'll be all over their body, and then they go to another flower to get more pollen, and then that pollen falls off their body onto the stigma, and then we have pollination occurring. So that's two ways that pollination can occur. The next step is fertilization. So once the pollen is on the stigma, it creates a pollen tube. And basically what will happen is that the pollen will attach at the stigma, and it will force a tube that will grow down the style. It'll go through this, and then it'll go into the ovary. Once it gets to the ovary, it's going to fertilize 4 ovules. The 4 ovules that are fertilized are going to produce a seed. And basically, one of the ovules will become the embryo, the actual seed that will be produced. The other 3 will become endosperm, which will act as a food source for that plant as it starts to grow. So now we have pollination occurring, then we have fertilization, which results in the production of a seed. The next thing we have to do is get that seed to grow into a new plant, and that process is called germination. Germination is the process of a fertilized seed starting to grow into a mature plant. And basically, seeds have the ability to lay dormant, which is unlike other organisms, for example, humans. Once fertilization occurs, it's 9 months, it's going to happen. And then the baby's here, and there you go. But plants can produce seeds, and those seeds can lay dormant for years until they start growing into an offspring. All right? Now, once the conditions are right, once the conditions are just perfect for that seed to continue to grow, it will germinate. It will break through the seed coat, which is the protective coating around the seed, and a radical will emerge that will eventually become the new plant. And that's what's great about seeds, is that they can lay dormant until conditions are right. If it's too dry, they're not going to germinate. But if it's got enough moisture and enough heat, we're good to go. All right? So let's take a look at our objectives and see what we learned. First of all, there's a difference between plants that produce flowers and plants that don't. First of all, the big difference is seeds. Now, there are some plants that produce seeds but don't produce flowers, and those are called gymnosperms. But all angiosperms produce flowers and therefore produce seeds. Gymnosperms produce cones and produce seeds. Those are the only 2 types of plants that produce seeds, gymnosperms and angiosperms. If you don't produce seeds, then you produce spores, like ferns and mosses and whatnot. Now, let's talk about the different parts of a flower. Right? We have the petals. We have, for the male, we have the filament and the anther, which make up the stamen. We have the style, the stigma, and the ovary, which make up the pistil. And those are the female reproductive structures. And in some flowers, we have those small protective structures on the outside of the flower called sepals. All right? So those are that. Now, how do flowering plants produce new plants? Well, they first have to be pollinated, meaning pollen from one plant to the other. Then that has to fertilize the 4 ovules, one being an embryo and the other 3 being the endosperm and the seed coat. And finally, we have germination, which is the seed has been produced. It now has current conditions that allow it to grow, and it will grow into a new plant. And finally, let's evaluate the importance of flowering plants to the world at large. Well, there are a lot of flowering plants out there. Why is it important? Well, that's how we get more plants. So when plants die, we need more plants. So flowering plants are incredibly important because we know that plants play a huge role. We eat plants. Plants produce oxygen. They do a whole lot of stuff for us, and we need to thank them. So go outside and thank a flower. All right, that's it for today. I hope this has been helpful. If not, feel free to email me or talk to me in class. We'll see you later.